Hey everyone, welcome back to Empowered and Out, the podcast where we focus on building careers that actually feel aligned, confident, and sustainable. I'm your host, Jonathan. Most people call me John, aka Coach John, career coach and advocate for fully showing up at work. And this season, we're exploring healing and resistance, what it means to recover from trauma, rebuild confidence, protect your mental health, and in today's conversation, confronting the lasting impact of conversion therapy, evangelical, evangelicalism. Ooh, how that's funny, and the long road back to yourself. And this year, we're doing things differently. We are evaluating, we're expanding, and we're prospering together through real conversations and coaching centered insights. My goal is to help you reconnect with your confidence, trust yourself more, and start making career choices that support not just your success, but your well-being too. And if you're thinking, okay, I'm ready for support with this, you can book a free call with me. The link is in the show notes. So take a breath, settle in, and let's get into today's conversation. My guest is Lucas Wilson, SSHRC postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto. I don't even know how to say that.
Mississauga.
Mississauga, thank you. And former Justice, Equity, and Transformation postdoctoral fellow at the University of Calgary. Lucas is the editor of Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivors' Stories of Conversion Therapy, and his writing has appeared in outlets like The Advocate, Queerty, LGBTQ Nation, and Religion Dispatches. He's also currently working on a new edited collection about LGBTQ plus experiences at Christian colleges, universities, seminaries, and divinity schools. In this episode, we're talking about conversion therapy, evangelicalism, Liberty University, and Lucas's lived experience as a gay student who spent 4 years in Liberty's conversion therapy program, and what it took to eventually leave high control religion and build a life beyond it. Trigger warning for those listening and viewing, this conversation includes themes that may be heavy for some listeners, including religious harm, conversion therapy, and identity-based trauma. So please take care of yourself as you listen and pause if you need to. So Lucas, thank you for being here. I'm really honored to actually have this conversation with you. And of course, welcome to Empowered and Out.
John, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So before we jump in, I've been asking all my guests this season, on a scale from 1 to 10, how is your energy today? And what's contributing to that number?
Oh, goodness. Today would be, I had lunch. I went into that sort of post-lunch stupor, and now I'm emerging. So I would say I'm at a good 7.5, 8 maybe. Let's go 8. Yeah, why not?
All right. Nice. I like that. It seems to be a consistent trend. 7 or 8 seem to be kind of where a lot of my guests have been. And that's okay. Let's be real. It's a little odd if you're at a 10 probably every day, because no way can you always be at a 10, where that's false. I'm not saying you can't be an 9, but a 10 would be a little pushing it. But
yeah, it's gratuitous. Too much.
Yeah. And for me, the funny thing is I'm actually at a 9 today. I'm having a great day. I'm excited for this conversation. I've been looking forward to this after we first chatted, and I'm excited for the listeners to hear our conversation. So let's get started. So to start us off, for people meeting you for the first time, how do you introduce yourself these days, and what feels most important for listeners to know about the work that you're doing right now?
Well, if I were thinking professionally how I would introduce myself, I would say I'm a postdoc. I'm a researcher in, multiple fields at this point. In the past, I started in literary criticism. So I worked a lot on representations of the Holocaust and also representations of the transmission of trauma between Holocaust survivors, their kids and their grandkids. That's my first monograph was on that topic. But because of the, amplification, the rise of public policy, legislation, hate and hate crimes against queer folks and trans folks in North America and the world, if we're being honest, I decided to shift my focus and look at one of the main causes or contributors to this climate of hatred, which is white Christian nationalism and how much they love us queers. So nowadays, I really focus on white Christian nationalism, and that's my research. But then I also do creative writing, which has been, the book that we're going to talk about today, and also the next book that I'm working on right now that's actually submitted to the press, waiting to get reviews back. We'll find out next month what they think, fingers crossed. But yeah, I've been dabbling in the world of creative writing as well. So I feel like I'm both in the academic world and the creative world, which is a really nice place to be. So I'd say professionally, I'm a researcher, but also a creative nonfiction writer.
Nice. So what drew you into doing public facing work on these topics, not just academic work?
Well, you know what? It's nice when people actually read your work. If you're in the academy, you're in a very specialized niche area. For me, it was Jewish literature and even more specifically Holocaust literature. And even more specifically than that, I mean, I did some work on other areas of Holocaust literature, but my main focus really was on the children and the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors and their writings. So for me, when I would write an article, I would get maybe a dozen people who would read it, or, now because my work's been out for a few years, I'm starting to get those notifications that people are citing my work and engaging with it, which is exciting. But again, when you have one or two or maybe three people in a year that you find out, are reading your work, it's not very fun. So there's certainly that aspect. Like, it's nice when I started to write more public facing work in queer news outlets. People would respond. People would say, "Hey, I read your work," or strangers occasionally, very very rarely, but occasionally would come up and say, "Hey, I read your piece," and I was like, "Oh my goodness, like this is so neat." So there certainly is that more fun aspect, but more importantly, it's where people are reading your work and it is making a difference, right? So when you have folks who are reading it, and again, not just two or three or a handful of people, but instead large groups of people, you do have people who will reach out, and beyond the just sort of, congratulations on writing your work, it's when people reach out and say things like, "Hey, that piece resonated with me. Hey, I feel like I saw myself in that. I went to Liberty. I went to conversion therapy. I whatever." That for me really is the beautiful part about public facing work, that you make a real world impact. And not to say that academics don't, they certainly do. And in fact, a lot of ideas about gender, sexuality that we talk about and use in mainstream culture today really do come from the academy, which is wonderful. But again, when you are confined to the academy and people, those ideas really slowly trickle out. I prefer, instead of that slow trickle, to just put my work out there, have people read it and engage with it, and hopefully again it resonates with them. And so that for me has been the rewarding part about public facing work, that your work is reaching audiences that perhaps it wouldn't reach otherwise. And ultimately, the people are, jiving with it. People see themselves in it, or that your writing in some way illuminates part of their experience in a way that's productive. That for me is really the important part about public facing scholarship.
Yeah, I love that. And it's interesting because even when I started doing this podcast, podcasts are it's so many, it's funny how so many people want to do a podcast and they don't realize how much work it is. But then, and this is my third one. The funny thing is, I feel like this is my most impactful one because I'm actually bringing things to light that really need to be talked about and need to be shared. And I feel very, very honored the amount of emails that I get from people saying, "Oh, I listened to so and so's guest spot on your podcast. Oh my gosh, that was so impactful. That meant this. Those really hit home." And honestly, that's why I'm doing this, because I don't need to become a Joe Rogan. I don't need to become a huge, like, make a gazillion dollars doing doing this. My thing is to get the message out. And the fact that I'm able to have guests like you come on and share, especially what we're going to talk about today, because it's something I have heard, I can't say I've heard it on podcasts, but I've heard it from other coaches that have talked about their experiences and helping clients in that regard. Kind of, because for me personally, because I did actually go to a religious university, this actually kind of struck a chord with me too, to want to bring it forward to have people listen. So I thank you again for coming on, because I think this is going to be really important. So I'd love to begin with the before part of your story. What was the world you grew up in, spiritually, culturally, emotionally? And what messages were you receiving about sexuality and identity?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I am the youngest of 5 kids. Though I don't come from a religious family, I always say that my mom was haunted by her Baptist demons, and that affected us in a certain sense. But my dad was an agnostic. He was sort of a hippity dippity record store owning, musician slash social worker. And he was just this really cool guy, vegetarian, wrote a book on Bob Dylan, that kind of guy. So it was a funny world to grow up in. And I think I'm thankful for both my parents because they at least gave me a personality. Although my mom had a lot of, what's the word, I guess, challenges, she at least gave me a sense of humor. And so here we are. And for growing up in that environment, I mean, we went to church when I was really little. But like any good Canadian family, we stopped going to church and went to the cottage by the time I was in about grade 2 or 3. So that meant for my siblings that they had more exposure to church and the Bible and Jesus, whereas I didn't until I decided that I wanted to go back to church when I was going into high school. And so I, again, grew up for a lot of my life really not going to church. And even the years that we did go to church when I was really young, it was not a consistent thing. We would go on and off. And so I had this exposure that I think in many ways piqued my interest. And then again, my mom's background and weird obsession with Jesus that it was an obsession in a sense that it would come up recurrently, but it wasn't necessarily something that was always there. It would just be like, I think almost like she'd feel bad about not taking us to church, so she'd take us back to church, and then would teach us our prayers or teach us how to say grace, and that was kind of the extent of it. Like, we didn't really talk about God in our home, and again, mostly because my dad just didn't give two hoots. So by the time I got into high school, my brother actually got me into the creation versus evolution debate. That for me, and for my
Ooh.
brother, clearly was something of interest. And he's like, Luke, you got to watch these debates I've been watching between these creationists and, university professors and scientists. And I was like, no chance in hell. Like, that doesn't sound like fun. But then he slowly wrote me into it and I got involved. I started watching. And by the end of it, I was like, okay, so if I believe that there is a creator, because these were coming from a creationist, although you had both sides, it was really promoting the creationist
Mhm.
worldview and sort of perspective. I decided, okay, if I believe there's a creator, I want to know who this creator is. It must be the God that I grew up with, when I was young. So I went back to the church that I had gone to, which was a fellowship evangelical Baptist church, which is pretty much the equivalent of a Southern Baptist church. It's very, very conservative. And so I went,
Yes, it is.
lots of fun, John. The barrel of monkeys that was to go back to that church. It was just highly conservative, highly restrictive, and, just a bunch of really socially awkward people. And if you had a social bone in your body and you were considered, cool, because a lot of the folks there were just, either homeschooled or just bizarre individuals because of, I guess their religion and their religious upbringing, right? And conservative religious upbringing. So I went to this church. I was at this point already in high school. I just started high school. I went to Rosedale Heights School of the Arts, which I think the writing was on the wall that I was a big old homosexual. But, the church offered me a very convenient cover for my sexuality. And so off to this church I went, and it was there that I got plugged in. And again, because I think I was half normal, the kids in the youth group thought I was, and the youth pastor thought I was, a cool kid, which maybe I wasn't, probably not. But at the time, this was the world I was living in, and this is how people saw me, at least there. And so I felt, okay, like an instant community, a cool community, and I got plugged in, and I really didn't, miss church. I didn't really miss youth group any week. I was just there consistently over and over, and I really, really got rooted in this very conservative religious community. And so for me, that was my childhood into my high school years. Eventually, when I made the decision of where I was going to go to university, I chose the super prestigious Liberty University, Jerry Falwell School. For those who know who Jerry Falwell is, you know what kind of school this is. And for those who don't, count your blessings. You don't want to know who Jerry Falwell is. So that was my upbringing. That was my childhood into my, youth. And then eventually, like I said, I went to the world's largest evangelical college in Lynchburg, Virginia. A lot to say about the name Lynchburg, but we'll put a pin on that for now.
Wow. Wow. It's interesting how your upbringing that you really didn't. The funny thing is, you did what a lot of families, though, did is that, I mean, I remember we went to church pretty consistently growing up. My mom, my dad, my sister, and I. I was in choir, so I got to go and enjoy that part of church. And for me, even to this day, my partner gives me so much grief because I don't know a lot of things like liturgically that go on through a service because I was in choir. I had to know, oh, when we come in after this hymn is over, or if this, when this happens, or what, through the order of the service. So it was just kind of funny. And for me, it's funny. I mean, because I did go to a Southern Baptist university, I went to Baylor. And Baylor, when I went there, was a lot more strict than it is now. And it, I mean, I'm sure Liberty was the same way that we had to take religion classes. You could not graduate if you did not take religion classes. I just had the fun of a cult in my town. I had the good old Branch Davidians down the street, and we got to watch a good old craziness happen in my freshman year. And so, but yeah, it's wow, yeah. It's funny that you really didn't have, you did, I feel like a lot of, because the typical families, and they still do it to this day, they go to like the standard services, like going to Christmas, going to like Easter, going to Palm Sunday, whatever. They go to these very specific, services where it's kind of where you want to be seen. And then you really didn't go a lot anymore after that. Now, when did you first start realizing, though, about your own identity that it didn't fit the framework around you?
So I think for me, I knew from a very young age, like I knew that I was gay for I don't know how long. I mean, probably since I was, oh gosh, I don't know if I can put a year on it, but it was definitely in, you know, elementary school for sure. Maybe grade two, grade three, around there. Yeah, give or take around there. Definitely by grade four. I remember my crushes in grade four. But around, yeah, maybe grade two or three. And I remember that for me, I mean, I grew up in Toronto. Toronto is a very progressive city in a lot of ways. It's also not like I've never been called the F slur more than in Toronto in the streets. So there's definitely that. That's a different sort of can of worms. But for me, again, Toronto's this very multicultural, progressive, cosmopolitan city. It's considered one of the most international cities in the world. And it was a great place to grow up. And so I do think had I come out, my teachers would have been super okay. And again, at Rosedale Heights School of the Arts, it would have been a-okay for me to come out. It was almost street cred to be queer, right? Whereas in my family, I knew that it wouldn't be safe because of my mom. My dad, again, was a hippity dippity kind of guy, wouldn't have given, he wouldn't have cared, could not have cared less had I come out. Whereas my mom made a number of comments growing up that it was not okay to be gay, at least not in her household. And, where one time we were driving to our cottage, and I remember it was Pride weekend, and my mom said to me, "Oh gosh, it's Pride weekend." And I was like, "Oh, really? Like, tell me more." And she's like, "Can you believe it? Isn't it disgusting? Like these guys going around flinging their things around." And I was just like, "Oh my gosh, like I don't want to talk about this with you." Meanwhile, like so curious to go and like get off the highway and go back to Toronto and find out what exactly was happening. But, you know, I knew from those comments that it was not going to be safe. I mean, she had said before, like she was so grateful for that all of her kids are straight. Things like this, these messages that you really clock when you're a young person or an older person, when they're coming from
Yeah.
someone like your mom. So for me, I knew I would not be coming out, and I didn't come out to her until I was 25. I was living in Nashville at the time when I eventually did come out, but I knew that as a kid it wasn't going to be okay. So I think in some ways, going to church was a way of again covering over that sexuality, at least in my own estimation. I think a lot of other people knew I was queer. My mom certainly didn't, which is so bizarre because I watched a lot of HGTV, a lot of Rachel Ray's 30-minute meal. She was somehow surprised when I came out. But, when I was a kid, I think that for me, and again, when I was going into high school and when I eventually went to church, that this was my way of saying, I can't be gay because I'm a Christian. And of course, within the evangelical imagination, emphasis on imagination, these are two mutually exclusive categories of identity. So in my mind, I was just like, well, I'm straight and I might quote unquote struggle with same sex attraction, the phrase that's typically used for those who are queer within Christian contexts. But again, was I fooling a lot of people? No. Was I fooling my mom? Yes. That's what mattered. And I was at least fooling myself into believing that I was not only not queer, but making progress to be come completely straight and not just someone who quote unquote struggled with same sex attraction.
So it's funny you say that about your mom, because my mom was the one who also didn't see it either. And it made me kind of chuckle, because I look back and I went to Whitney Houston, for crying out loud. Like, I mean, my friends were going to REM and I went to Whitney Houston. I mean, can you get any gayer? I mean, I was wanting to go to the musicals when they came touring around into Kansas City, where I grew up. I didn't want to, and we would always go into different theater things. Now, I don't know if they just didn't want to believe it. I kind of feel like in some way, in the back of my mom's head, that she kind of knew, she just didn't want to really believe it
Mhm.
in a way. I don't know. I just, because, I mean, I did the whole, I mean, you just went from, I mean, you have a crazy experience that we're about to jump into, but like I was going to church. I went to Baylor. I went to working at a Christian sports camp. And I mean, so when I did finally come out, and ironically at 25, my parents were like, wait, what? Because they couldn't believe it. Now, for me, I was kind of the same way, though. I kind of had an idea, because I did have crushes on some, there was definitely some guys in my class that I was like, ooh. And of course, it didn't help that I was an athlete. So I'm naked with these guys in a locker room, in a shower, whatever. So that's not helpful by any means. So yeah, I don't know. Sometimes I feel that, I mean, maybe she really had no clue. It's funny to me, though, that you're the fifth child and you can't, to me, I don't know. Sometimes I feel parents purposely kind of selectively want to believe what they want to believe and not what really was happening, just to make sure that everything was good. And they weren't as a quote unquote bad parent, which there's nothing wrong with the parent that has a child that's gay. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But growing up, I can see 100% in the church that especially that you went to, and then now continuing on going to Liberty. Whew, I can definitely see where that's not the statement you want to say out loud to family by any means. So let's talk about Liberty. So when you got to Liberty University, what did the environment feel like at first, and how did you end up? I mean, how did you end up in conversion therapy?
Mhm. I remember I had visited Liberty multiple times before I went there. I visited 6 times before I eventually went to the
Oh
school,
wow.
and I loved it before. I thought it was so cool. I thought it was so exciting. I thought it was so, Jerry Falwell used to always say, if it's Christian, it ought to be better. And I used to think that Liberty was, it. Liberty was kind of everything. And when I eventually got there, it was very, very, very different than how I had experienced it those 6 times before. And in large part, this was because of the dorm I was on my freshman year. I, to this day, don't know worse people than a number of those guys. Like some of the most unkind, rude, like sincerely mean individuals. I was never really bullied in school. I mean, maybe like the smallest amount in like maybe like grade 8. But even then it was like nothing happened. Like I was fine by and large. The kid was just didn't like me and whatever. I was fine. I didn't really get bullied. But then I got to Liberty and it was just some grade A B holes. Like these kids were so awful. I to this day have a lot of disdain for them. Like, I truly to this day think they are just really, really bad human beings, like, to put it mildly. And that was such a surprise because I was again expecting this really exciting, fun, vibrant environment, and I did find some amazing people at the time. I'm still in contact with some of my friends from Liberty, but that first year specifically, it was filled with a lot of regrettable characters. And I wish that I never encountered any of them. Not any of them, most of them. There are a few who I still stay in contact with today. But after that, the environment got a little bit better because I changed dorms. I went to a different dorm, and my dorm was like the best it could have been, I think, at Liberty. It was still highly restrictive. The rules were wild. We had a curfew. Every what is it? Monday to Monday to Thursday, except Tuesday was earlier, and then Friday, like, and 12 o'clock was the regular curfew. But then on weekends you could stay until 12:30. Like, super generous with that extra half hour. You couldn't wear certain things in certain buildings and in certain places. You couldn't have your shirt off, like, unless you were in your dorm. All sorts of just ridiculous rules looking back. No smoking, of course. I
Wow.
mean, I used to smoke cigarettes there, thinking I was like super bad. I would hide them and sneak them out with my roommate. But, these kinds of things that you had to hide, and, you weren't allowed to drink. I drank when I got into my second year, or my, sophomore year. And, from there was considered a bad boy. But I wasn't. Like, I was just having a few beers. And so, all of this kind of stuff, it was a very restrictive culture. It was also a culture of surveillance where everyone around you was watching you and trying to keep you in line, trying to make sure that you're on the straight and narrow, pun completely intended, trying to make sure that you are, following the rules. And if you're not, well, then they feel bad and they feel complicit in you, acting up. And so they will go report you. And it's very common for people to report people. And then, leadership, snitching on people, and then people getting fined, or, having to do community service, or even getting expelled. So the surveillance
Wow.
culture was wild. And then on top of that, like, not only are you watching people and people are watching you, you start to internalize how people are watching you, to the point that you become your own surveiller, you become your own monitor, and you start watching what you do, and really, again, internalizing that sort of panopticon that is Liberty University. And so it was this place that really shaped, or really instilled, a culture of fear in how you operated. You didn't want to break a rule. You didn't want to upset people. You didn't want to offend people. And it was just this really bizarre, upside down moral universe that, looking back, is so contrary to the world I live in now. Even in the sense of, like, or especially in the sense of, what's considered right, I don't consider right anymore. I actually consider it wrong. What's considered wrong there, I consider the exact opposite. I think it's quite right. And so the inversion of morality, and the way that you are made to feel bad. So then I think the shame aspect and the guilt aspect comes in too. It's a really twisted world that's highly manipulative and really controlling. It's a top-down institution. So you have the leadership at the top, like, the administrators and the professors, and then that is passed down to the student leadership, who then, control the rest of the, plebeians who weren't necessarily spiritual enough to be on student leadership. And it really creates a culture that I don't miss at all, believe it or not.
Wow. Wow. The biggest restrictions we had at Baylor was like, you could go into the girls' dorm, but it was only on Saturdays, I think, and Sundays. And it was between like 10 a.m. and like 1 p.m. It was something very restricted. The doors had to be wide open. You could never shut the door. There definitely would have been no clothing coming off.
Right.
But clearly, there was boys' dorms and girls' dorms. There was never obviously any commingling. My sister went to a university where she was in a mixed dorm, and I was like, oh, that would definitely not have happened in Baylor. Oh my gosh, I can't even imagine just on how strict it was back then. I mean, but wow.
Yeah,
Wow. Like
we had
I'm just in awe.
Well, you know what? We had open dorms where we were allowed to go into the opposite sex's dorm, quote unquote opposite, I should say.
Yeah.
Once a semester. And again, doors open, heavily monitored. But otherwise, no, you weren't allowed to do that. We weren't allowed to dance. We weren't allowed to watch certain movies. We weren't allowed to listen to certain music if it had expletives in it, depending on the song. Uh, you know, No rated R movies when I was there, other than Passion of the Christ. That was allowed. Because Catholic Mel
Wow.
Gibson's representation of
Yeah.
Jesus' life and resurrection, or and execution were allowed. But I mean, yeah, there were so many rules, and you couldn't wear a hat to class. I remember when I went to grad school, I was nervous on my first day because I thought to myself, well, am I actually allowed to wear a t-shirt to class? And I thought, I'm going to get in trouble. I might be asked to leave. And honest to goodness, like I wish that I was joking, but I remember thinking, there's no way that they're going to be upset, right? But then I was like, right? Like sort of hoping that, that they wouldn't be upset. My professor wouldn't be upset. But then I was like, you know what? F this. I'm going to go to class and just see what happens. And so I went, but I was nervous that first day wearing a t-shirt until I saw everyone else wearing a t-shirt because it had been ingrained in me to, again, you live in this culture of fear to the point where you think to yourself, maybe this is going to be a rule at a non-Christian university, a secular university. It obviously wasn't, but this is the kind of, enduring effect, or one of the enduring effects of going to a school like that, where you question everything, you second guess everything when it comes to rules that, should I do this, should I not? And it's this constant anxiety of following rules. And if I don't, well, I could get in trouble. And it really did last for quite some time beyond Liberty.
I mean, don't get me wrong. Rules to a certain capacity are fine. But when you take them to the utter extreme, just a kind of a ridiculous example. So in my dorm, my freshman year, we had some very obnoxious guys on our hall. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. And we happened to have the fire extinguisher right outside of our door. And we were actually diagonal from our resident assistant. Like he was diagonal from us. Well, there were some guys in our dorm that continuously would go and bash the glass, and so they had to keep replacing it, replacing it, replacing it. And the funny thing is, nothing ever. I mean, I don't know the punishment the students ever got. I don't know because I didn't pay attention. I was never in my dorm. But our our resident assistant, he tried to be really, really strict. And of course, that actually just fueled the fire for them to be more and more obnoxious. The things that were broken my freshman year in our dorm was insane. Now, that was the first semester. Second semester, that guy left. I don't know where he went, but he went to somewhere else. And we got a new resident assistant that came in. He had his door open all the time. He invited guys on the floor to play video games, whatever it was. And the destruction completely gone because he was trying to be, a buddy, a friend to these guys and not being so rule driven. It just, I mean, the calm that second semester was so much nicer than the chaos that we felt that first semester. And I kind of feel like, yes, when we're at that age, and for a very good chunk of students that are going into university, whatever, most of the time it's our first time being away from our parents. So it's almost a given that destruction or stupid things that we're going to do dumb things. And I feel that if you put these barriers so strict, I kind of feel in some ways they're going to be actually worse after they get out of college. It may not be like that in college because they're not allowed to do it, but or they just sneak around and do it. Like you even joked, you're like, yeah, you drank beer and you were like considered like a bad person. And it's like, oh my goodness. Now, I don't know if I honestly drank at all my freshman year. So, I mean, there wasn't anything to do in Waco where I went to Baylor. I was going out of town. I was going and visiting friends in other cities around in Texas. So that's why I honestly don't remember. And we had the same thing, no dancing. We couldn't dance on campus. There was no dancing. Now, that did change near the end of my years at Baylor, but the restrictions I saw, the more and more restrictions they put on, the more chaotic and disruptive the student body became. And I never saw a kid disappear. They were always there. It's not like they got kicked out or expelled or whatever for the most part. Um, Again, but it's interesting to see and hear the extremes that Liberty University went to, because to me that just sounds so miserable. to like be day in and day out living that.
Yeah, I mean, down the road, I eventually became a resident advisor at Vanderbilt. So I know what it's like on a real university's
Yeah.
campus and what res life is like. And we had rules, obviously, but I mean, nothing like that. But Liberty, I think Liberty, we had so many, like your RA the first semester, we had so many resident advisors who just like lived for the power that they got and that small amount of power that they got, that they hung on to and clung to so tightly because they finally had some ability or some agency almost,
Mhm.
or power over someone, that they exerted that power whenever they possibly could. They were a bunch of power trippers. It was just wild. It was like they were like glorified hall monitors and they just loved it. And I think for Liberty, we wouldn't have been able to get away with what you were describing, like people breaking stuff over and over. They would have been kicked out quite quickly, I think, or just punished until they would eventually rack up enough points, or what we call it, like reprimands, essentially. We call them points by the end of my time at Liberty, um, where they would have been expelled, or kicked out, or whatever the term is, for Liberty, so I don't get sued by them later. But I think that it just wouldn't have happened. Liberty would have. It just wasn't a possibility. I think that I know people who left or were pushed out. I know people who left voluntarily because they were like, "This is just ridiculous. Get me the hell out of this environment." I never did. I always just, again, I was never caught for doing anything wrong. I did a lot of things that were wrong, at least according to their standards, but I was never caught. I was at least, had a brain in my head not to get caught. So I think that, yeah, it would have been different had it not been for the RAs. But the RAs were so ever present, it felt like, on the campus, where people were always watching and everyone was watching each other. It wasn't just the RAs, it was also prayer leaders, it was also spiritual life directors, it was also just people in your prayer groups, right? Like everyone's just sort of watching you. And I think that really made for the culture that I described, that precluded a lot of tomfoolery happening, or fun happening as well. And again, everyone just kind of went in on it together, because Liberty had this phrase when I was there. They referred to the peer pressure in the right direction, which is this horrifying idea, but it's not really peer pressure. It's institutional pressure passed down to student leaders, who then push that on to other students, who then internalize it. And then everyone becomes again, each other's sort of peer pressure, but it's all uh,
Wow.
institutionally constructed. So it was a very bizarro land to go to undergrad. I eventually had to go to grad school to learn properly and receive or to, I guess, claim a real education, because the education I received at Liberty, I can't define it as academic by any means.
Wow. That is not what I could say about Baylor. Baylor, I definitely received a true education. I learned a lot and I had some amazing courses that I learned outside of the religion courses that I had to take. But for me, like I mentioned earlier, my freshman year was the whole Branch Davidian craziness. And I happened to be actually taking a religion class at the time. I was actually taking Old Testament. I kind of wish I had been taking New Testament at the time, but I was taking Old Testament, and we did actually kind of pause on teaching, and we had another professor come in and talk about all of that craziness. And so all of us in our class got to receive, and it's somewhere in all of my stuff, I'm sure, at my parents' house still, but it was David Koresh's interpretation of Revelation. And it was so fascinating. And just reading it, and now, of course, many years later, seeing all the craziness about what all really happened there, I just go, how did no one ever really think that this was a cult? Like, I just don't get it. Like, he screams cult leader, like hardcore cult leader. And I've asked many, many people over the years, like, I don't understand why so many cults seem to have a sex driven leader, that you have to have sex with them. Like, that's nowhere in the Bible. Jesus didn't do that. No one else said you had to do that. And they try to make it a religion based, religion or cult, whatever. And yet that's not what the Bible even says. So it's just like, what? I don't understand. But all right, let's talk about what I referenced earlier, and what the conversion therapy program. So you were in this program for 4 years. Yikes. During that time, what was happening internally for you, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, that you think people on the outside often don't see?
I was very good at hiding what I was feeling. And that comes from a long time of being in the closet because I was in the closet then too, right? I think all
Yeah.
queers have we've practiced lying, we've practiced obfuscating the truth, we've practiced concealing ourselves because we've had to, we've been forced to, we've been coerced to it. So I think that because of that, I had the ability to let not show others that I was feeling what I was feeling. And so the way that it worked for me was that I got to Liberty. And again, I really quickly realized I hated the guys on my dorm. And they were just, again, god awful people. And part of that, though, or one thing I will say is that there was one person on my dorm who was nice to me and I was super excited to be friends with him and he took a special interest in me. I didn't realize that it was a sexual interest. I didn't have much experience flirting, so I didn't know what was going on. I feel sort of silly saying that because it's like nowadays you of course know who's flirting with you, but at the time it was just not a thing that happened. And if it did happen,
Well, and then you got to look at the context of where you were too. I mean, you
yeah.
weren't going to even think, oh, some guy in my dorm's going to start hitting on me. I mean,
No, exactly. And
that
I
wouldn't
think
have
that
probably
so
even
many
thought
like
about it.
Christian guys who are so nice, at least on ostensibly nice, that you read that as, oh, they're just a Christian guy. Like they're just
Yeah.
being, Christ-like. But this guy, by the end of it, essentially what happened, we hooked up and he immediately after wouldn't talk to me, like refused to speak to me afterwards. He was just, dealing with his own stuff, I suppose, and felt really guilty and really ashamed of what he had done. And so immediately he's like, we can never do this again. Like, leave me alone. Don't talk to me again. And I was like, what the heck? What do I do? And so for a long time, for like, I think it was at least a few weeks, if not over a month, so months, that I would just like cry by myself in the parking lot. And then, because I had two roommates, again, talk about surveillance. You can't do anything in your room. You have to like always be watching out for your roommates when they come back or if they're in the room, whatever. So I'd go cry in the parking lot. And then sometimes I'd call my mom right after. I wouldn't tell her obviously what had happened. But I just wanted to at least feel in some ways comforted, even if I couldn't express it directly what was going on. Um, but I eventually I decided, well, I have no one on campus with whom I can speak other than one friend. One friend did guess what happened because I read him a poem about what I had gone through. And looking back, like how gay can you get, right? I wrote a poem about what happened and I told him, I can't tell you what happened, but I can read you the poem I wrote. So he guessed. He was another man of the persuasion. So he knew what, these dog whistles were that I was writing in my poem. So he and I talked about it, but again, I didn't want to just put that emotional burden on him. And I also didn't think that he had the answers I was looking for at the time because I thought I need some help to overcome this, to work through this, to get over this. And so I knew that Liberty had a conversion therapy program even before I went to Liberty. I didn't call it a conversion therapy program. I just knew that they had a pastor on staff who worked with quote unquote guys like me, big old homos. And so I was like, so I knew that going into Liberty. And so my big plan really was when I went to Liberty, I was like, okay, I'm going to go to Liberty. I'm going to have my fun with Christian guys because my big idea was that I never wanted to be a bad witness for Jesus. So I couldn't do anything with guys who weren't Christians. But I knew that there were going to be other gays like me at Liberty. So I'd go, date a few Christian guys, do whatever. And no one would be, that would be bad PR for Jesus. I wouldn't be giving Jesus a bad witness. And so I thought, after that, I'll go and meet with this pastor on campus, like just before I graduate. He'll turn me straight and I'll go home and marry a woman. Like that was my big idea. It didn't work out the way that I thought it would. But what I did was because again, that was my plan. I was like, okay, let's just fast track this plan because I need to talk to this guy. I have no one else with whom I can speak about this. I need to go and, we start meeting with him. So I made a fake email. The email was like, I was like, what's like the furthest thing away from like me? And at the time, 18-year-old Luke was, I just graduated from Rosedale Heights School of the Arts. So I was like, okay, Texas football fan. So my email was like Texas football fan at Hotmail or whatever it was. So made this like funny persona. And I asked him, I said, if I come talk to you, will I get in trouble? He said, nope. Unless you're going to physically self-harm, you're not going to, like your secret's safe with me. So come meet with me. So I did. I met with him over the span of the 4 years. And so I went to the group conversion therapy program once. And that's actually the story that I write about in Shame, Sex, Attraction, the book that came out last year. I reserved the story about me and one-on-one conversion therapy for the book that's coming out next year. So that one will
Nice.
be eventually released. And part of what I'm saying right now really is that story. When eventually I did go and meet with this pastor, it looked a little bit different in the very first initial meetings that we had. In the beginning, it was very much taking almost a family inventory of my relationships. So looking at what was my relationship like to my mom, to my dad, like very pseudo Freudian, but really like an all you can eat buffet, taking what aligns with his theory and leaving what didn't. So he was asking me about, my relationship with my parents, my siblings, friends, whatever. And so he eventually decided that the reason why I was gay was because I had an overbearing mother, which is true. Like my mom was overbearing. Cheryl was wild, whereas my dad was not absentee. He wasn't emotionally distant. He wasn't removed from my life. He was arguably much more involved in my life in a lot of ways than my mom, although my mom had more perhaps power in my life and control over me in certain sense. So because of that relationship, that was going to be the theory that we went with, that I'm gay, or at least quote unquote struggle with same sex attraction because of my relationship, my faulty relationship with my mom. So from there, that was the theoretical foundation for how we were going to approach this. And so we decided that if I could fix, at least emotionally, how I relate to my mom and how then I relate to women in general, I could again change how my gender identity, my gender expression, and then or gender expression, then my gender identity, and then how I would change my sexuality. So it was believed that because I was more involved in the world of women because of my mom, before I hit puberty, I was very much aligning with capital F femininity. And because of that, when I hit puberty, I went for quote unquote what was opposite of me. And according to this theory, within this binary understanding of gender and sexuality, that what's opposite, if I was living in the world of femininity, would have been, according to this thinking, masculinity. So that's why I was attracted to boys. And then over time, I habituated that, attraction, according to this theory, to the point that I became and identified as a big old queer. So if I were only, according to Pastor Dane Emmerich, my conversion therapist, to start to do the things that men do and talk the way that men talk and talk about the things that men talk about, that if I were to do these things, I could change how I express myself gender wise, which would then change my gender identity, where I would identify as a real man. And of course, part of what a real man is an essentialist understanding of, heterosexuality. And then if I identify as a real man, part of that will then, or in turn, my sexuality will change. So that was the theory. That was what we went with. And I believed it. And so what we would do on a weekly basis, we would meet, and I shouldn't say weekly. There were times where I didn't go as often, but I certainly went every year. I went every semester, mostly regularly. And he and I met for, again, the vast majority of my undergrad. And we would talk about these kinds of things. And so in the beginning, after we had those first initial meetings where we established, the working theory of why I was gay, we then started to do certain things. So we always would read scripture together. We would always pray together. He always prayed for me, which I find quite telling. Like he interceded on my behalf. Like I was not the one to speak to God directly, but he was that, funny intermediary. And then we would read a book together. Mine was called Growth into Manhood, Resuming the Journey by Alan Medinger, one of the former presidents of Exodus International. And we would also talk about my victories and my slip ups. My victories were moments where I avoided temptation. I went for a run instead of looking at pornography or whatever it would have been. And then slip ups were moments that I gave in to my temptation. So I looked at a man lustfully, or whatever, did whatever. And so these were the things that we would talk about, and we would take that inventory every single week. And he always asked very detailed questions about my sexual or my sexcapades at the time. And that was always super uncomfortable. And then at the end, and also at the beginning of every meeting, he would give me like this weird bear hug, which looking back is so creepy. But at the time, I always thought about it as he's tutoring me in how to interact in a healthy way to other men. The good touch, bad touch, very like infantilizing. But the other part was that whenever we prayed, he'd put his hand on my leg. And again, this is something that I was talking to a friend, and when he said this, I was like, oh my gosh, me too. It was never low enough down on my leg that I didn't clock it, but it was never high enough on my leg that I said like, hey, don't do that. But it was high enough on my leg that you noticed it every time, like those warm hands on your leg. And so that was certainly part of it too. There was that tactile aspect. And so that was really, for all intents and purposes, that was my time in conversion therapy. And again, it was over the span of 4 years, and it was always very, very similar. And this is really the formulaic approach to changing my sexuality. I've shared this with many people, and some people in a very weird way. I still find it bizarre that people have said this, but who am I? They've said like, that doesn't sound so bad. And I'm like, oh, cool. Thanks for telling me how my experience was. And if we are to take that comment, in some ways seriously, that, okay, maybe it's not that bad. What I was supposed to, what happened for me, I really do think the violence of my conversion therapy experience was not in the moment. I think that for me, the violence really came after. And the reason is that I was made to believe that if I did these certain things, I performed these spiritual exercises, if I fasted, which I fasted a lot at Liberty, and if you count up the number of weeks that I would have fasted, it would have been a matter of months that I just didn't eat during my undergrad
Wow.
because I thought this was something I should be doing. And read scripture and prayed and met with this pastor, Dane, and done all these things. I thought if I do these things over time, God's going to reward that and I'm going to become straight, or bare minimum, at least find attraction to one woman, marry her, and then, everything will be fine. That didn't happen, obviously. And I got to grad school and started to realize when I was outside of the Liberty bubble and there wasn't this constant surveillance, there wasn't this weird upside down understanding of morality where people were sharing ideas and theories and, thoughts that differed from my own, where I started to say, oh, wow, that makes a lot more sense than what I've been taught for the past, 8 years in the church and then at Liberty, together, a cumulative about 8 years at the time. And then starting to see these holes and these cracks in my world that really with this like sacred canopy that I was like, this makes no sense, or parts of this make no sense, or that's silly, or that's stupid, or whatever. And over time, I started to see these different, see things differently. But the thing was, for a long time, even though I had the head knowledge that things were changing in my mind, my heart was, it took a little bit longer to sort of catch up. And I remember thinking at the time, okay, I believe that God's perfect. And if God's perfect and God wants me to change, that's what is God's will, for me to change my sexual orientation. That if I'm not changing, it's not God's fault because, well, God's perfect. Therefore, it's someone else's fault. Whose fault is it? It's my fault. And I'm the reason that I'm not changing. I'm the problem. And when you see yourself as a problem, that's, of course, a problem. Right. So the guilt that I used to feel,
Yeah.
because I would feel bad for like individual actions that I did. So if I, looked at porn, or if I masturbated, or whatever I did, these were the things that for like those discrete individual actions, I felt guilty, but I didn't feel necessarily a certain sense of shame. I think I felt shame in other ways, but in that sense, I didn't feel shame, because shame is really where you feel guilt's like, oh, I did one bad thing and I feel bad for that thing. Shame is where, oh, it's not just that I did one thing bad, it's that I myself am bad, right? In that sort of negative energy turns inwards. So I think that guilt that I felt for a long time for individual actions, that guilt turned into shame, and that shame turned into a lot of self-hatred. And that self-hatred just really snowballed and it really consumed me for a long time. Because again, I was just ripped and torn over the fact that I was not changing. And again, I must be a problem. I must be, messed up to such an extent that I'll never change. I'm never going to live a happy life. And, I've got potentially hell to look forward to if I can't ultimately fit. So I think that for me, that's the violence of conversion therapy that really had a lot of negative effects in the years after. In the moment, I think that in a lot of ways it felt good because I was made to believe that, again, Dane was like making me not feel horrible about being queer, because he was the first Christian to say, yeah, it's bad to be gay, but you're not a horrible, awful person simply because you're gay. I mean, he was again able to separate those actions from me in a lot of ways. But when I didn't have that emotional support from him, and again, it was obviously misguided, it was obviously twisted, it was obviously effed up, to put it academically. But nonetheless, in the moment, it felt better. Whereas afterwards, that I didn't have that sacred canopy, that liberty bubble to make me feel okay. And that's really, again, when I turned on myself in a lot of ways. And so I'd say that for me was the really difficult part of conversion therapy, was the aftermath of it. And that's what I identify as the violence.
So going into that, looking back, what do you wish more people understood about the long-term impact of that kind of harm, of that conversion therapy?
I wish, and this is something that'll never happen, I wish evangelicals would be honest with themselves and with others. But again, that's never going to happen. Evangelicals don't know how to be honest
True.
with themselves and others, because their world is not rooted in reality. It's rooted in this really fragile construction of what they want to be reality. Again, that sacred canopy, that bubble, whatever you want to call it. And it's so fragile that they have to constantly maintain it. They have to constantly repeat, for instance, songs where they repeat over and over and over this mantra, this ritual, this repetition really is a way of reinforcing over and over and over and over, because they need to reinforce over and over and over and over. That's why, there's, prayer, and again, saying grace. It's just this constant way of keeping that world, quote unquote, real, at least real for them. And so for me, I mean, what I wish I had known, and I wish evangelicals knew, is that well, just like enough of the charade. Like, let's just be honest with ourselves and with others. But again, honesty is not their goal and honesty is not their forte. So I think in either case, it's not going to happen, right? But I mean, I wish I could go back and tell, young queer Luke, it's fine to be gay, it's fine to be whatever. I don't think I would have listened, to be honest. That's another problem too, because if it's anything that breaks script, anything that differs from, what the majority within that, community believe, then you're considered heretical. You're considered, a threat to that sacred order. So I don't even think I would have listened to myself had I, been able to go back and talk to myself. But I would have loved to have been able to believe and I believe it was okay to be queer, to accept myself at the time, but I didn't. And I don't think I had the ears to hear that at the time. And as a result, I went on the path that I went on. And for me, really, it was grad school that saved my life. It was actually learning and actually receiving and claiming an education for myself that really changed how I understand myself in relationship to my faith. I'm not a person of faith anymore. I don't believe Jesus as my savior, but I did for a long time. And I was able to reconcile that for a while until eventually my studies and mostly my research in the Holocaust that pushed me away from God in a way that I'm very thankful for. I'm glad that I gave up that fiction that I believed in before. However, it really was, it really was grad school that saved my life, because I'd probably be married to a woman with kids in a very unhappy marriage that I would be looking to get out of at this point. But thank goodness that didn't happen, though I do know a number of people for whom that did happen. But in either case, I'm glad that I went the route of academia because it allowed me to be where I am today.
Yeah, for sure. Wow. Wow. So you answered a question I was going to ask, so I'm going to scroll down a little bit more. All right. So your work now includes editing shame, sex, attraction, and writing and speaking publicly about conversion therapy. What have you learned from survivor stories, including your own, about shame, resilience, and what healing can actually look like?
Shame is an emotion, first and foremost, which that's not, I don't think, new to anyone. But as an emotion, it supersedes reason in a lot of arenas. And you might be an incredibly intelligent, educated, well informed, well read person, but shame, like a number of emotions, can eclipse intellect, eclipse reason, and there's no talking a person down. There's no ability to move around that deep seated, all encompassing, overwhelming emotion. I know a number of people, and this goes beyond shame. I think, again, this goes just to the emotions of evangelicalism, or the affective environment of evangelicalism, emotional environment of evangelicalism. Again, they're not dumb people. They're not stupid. They're not, ignorant. They're not living in a hole. And they acknowledge so many of the plot points, or like the missing plot points, or the contradictions, or the illogical nature of so many aspects of the Christian faith. And yet they cannot give up their faith, or they won't give up their faith. They can, but they won't, because of how deep seated the shame is. And I think Christian theology, a constitutive, like a defining feature of Christian theology, is shame, because there would not be the need for Jesus to come and die on the cross if it weren't for humanity's so-called shame, so-called sin, right? That even if we look at the book of Isaiah, that says that, even our righteousness, according to God, is like filthy rags in the eyes of God. Filthy rags is an ancient way of saying use tampons. So like your goodness, any good deed that you do, at its best, is a used tampon, according to God. Okay, if that's how you see yourself, and that's how you see even like the positive aspects of yourself, that breeds, and again, necessitates shame. You have to feel bad about yourself in order for you to feel the need for a savior. And that is a system that I have no respect for, like none. I think that's a despicable, mind controlling way of managing populations, in this case, Christians. And so with that being said, I have, again, a number of intelligent friends who cannot get over the shame that comes with Christianity. And if we're talking even more specifically about their gender or sexuality, if it's a non-normative gender or sexuality, they can't get over that either. And so it's this really this research, and then writing about it and speaking about it and talking about it with people and learning from people as I go. These are some of the lessons that I didn't have the language for this when I was in the church. I didn't have the ability to communicate what I wanted to communicate, or what I am communicating now, because I didn't have the, again, intellectual resources. And again, grad school
Hmm.
really helped me, but also just having great conversation partners since, whether they be academics or outside of the academy. And so I think that for me is a really big lesson. And it's something that for a long time I always just thought, well, religion's fine. It's, benign. It doesn't really do anything. And it's only the manipulation of religion that's bad. And it's like, no, I do think like a constitutive part of Christianity, again, is shame. Another part is that Christianity is by definition a colonizing force. The colonizing force is that the goal of Christianity is to go out and make disciples for Jesus, really, which is another way of saying making self-similar subjects to go out and do the same and just keep going and going and going and building the quote unquote empire. Like, that's terrifying. That goal to erase difference, to get rid of people who look and sound and act differently from you, that's in no way a noble goal. Evangelism is a colonizing effort. And for me, again, these are the things that I've learned as I've gone, about talking about, or I've learned as I've talked about and read about and studied and researched and written what I've written and read and spoken on. And for me, I think these are the big lessons, that religion isn't benign, and that we need to really name accurately what is the harm and where the violence is. Is it the manipulation of religion? No, I think it's when you take religion seriously. In this case, when you take Christianity seriously, you can see point blank what the problems are. And the problems are, it's a colonizing effort that necessitates shame.
Wow. So, in talking and researching, were there themes that kept showing up across different survivor stories?
Shame. No, I mean, yeah, right. Like I think that for all of us. And you know what? This aligns with the research. The research, there was a recent Canadian study, or a more recent Canadian study. It's not necessarily, it's a few years out now, but the number one cited consequence of conversion therapy was shame. And that, right away you see that, and then you see the stories. And again, the reason why the title of the book is Shame Sex Attraction, a play on same-sex attraction, is because the red thread that unites all of these stories is shame. I mean, there's a number of other, unifying features: guilt, anxiety, having to monitor and watch yourself and make sure that you're presenting yourself in a way that's quote unquote acceptable or godly, or, at least passable. And trying to, lower your voice so it doesn't sound too gay, to watch your hands that are too animated, whatever, right? The anxiety that comes with that. These are all parts of conversion therapy as well, or just being queer in general, I suppose. But I always think about conversion therapy as a very concentrated form of homophobia and or transphobia, right? It's just really in one programmatic, concentrated space that we find homophobia and transphobia. Again, I think that every queer person has experienced homophobia and or transphobia, but not everyone's experienced conversion therapy, thank God. But I do think that everyone's experienced at least conversion practices, which is to say efforts on individuals other than ourselves parts to change how we act, to change how we talk, to change what we talk about, right? These are what are considered, according to the research, conversion practices, not necessarily conversion therapy. Conversion therapy is that programmatic approach to this. But, when your mom or your dad says, hey, don't sit like that, you look like a sissy. Hey, you can't play with that. Girls don't play with that. Whatever it is, these are messages that accumulate over time. And these are conversion practices. And so, again, although not every queer person has experienced conversion therapy, thank God, every queer person has experienced conversion practices. And I think that when we think about it that way, we can see that this research really, we can see ourselves as queer people through this research in many ways. Again, hopefully, folks didn't experience that, but, reading these stories or hearing people talk about these things, I think we can all kind of see ourselves in one way, shape, or form.
Yeah, for sure. I would agree. So you're now working on, as we've mentioned a few times, a new edited collection about LGBTQ plus experiences at Christian colleges, universities, seminaries, and divinity schools. What feels urgent about this project right now, and what conversations are you hoping that it opens up?
What I wish that I had have done this project a few years ago. Granted, there were, I was in my PhD program and, around this time, no, during this time. And then on top of that, afterwards, I've been working on other projects that have eventually led me to this project. But if I could go back, it would be wonderful if I could go back and work on this then, because there was a class action lawsuit against the US Department of Education before Trump. This was actually during Biden's administration. And we sued the government, saying, because it was a number, I think it was like 40 or 41 plaintiffs from Christian colleges, universities across the US. We sued the US government saying, if you are going to give these schools, the schools that we went to, or for some of the plaintiffs who were still at these schools, public funds, taxpayer dollars, these schools should not be able to discriminate against queer and trans students in the same way that schools cannot discriminate on the basis of race or on the basis of sex. That we were saying gender and sexual orientation should also be covered, and that if these schools want to discriminate, they shouldn't, but if they want to, they should be doing it on their own dime, not on the taxpayer's dime. We somehow lost that lawsuit. Looking back, I think it's absolutely bonkers that we lost. But what I hope, and building on that lawsuit and the amazing work that our lawyers did, specifically Paul Southwick, who led the charge and led the lawsuit, I hope that this book raises awareness, not only that there are queer students at these schools, and there's a significant population of queer students at these schools, there for a number of reasons. And I'm sure you get the question all the time, why'd you go to Baylor? And for me, why'd you go to Liberty? I mean, again, I have
Yeah.
reasons, and there are a number of us who have very different reasons, and there's a whole host of reasons. But putting those reasons aside, regardless of why a queer or trans student is there, these schools should not be able to do what they're doing if, again, they're receiving taxpayer dollars.
Yeah.
So I wish that this book, or I hope that this book, like the lawsuit, raises awareness about this. I hope that it reanimates some of these conversations and that people are able to see themselves in these stories, if in fact they've gone through that, and find some sort of maybe comfort or at least solace, in the fact that they're not alone. But on top of that, I hope that it finds that this collection put pressure in some way, shape, or form on the US government, though granted the current administration, I don't think it's very likely.
Yeah.
So there's that. But in the future, that these stories allow for these conversations to continue to the point that queer and trans students are protected at these schools.
I agree. And yeah, no, it's nothing's going to change right now with that awful administration that's in office right now. Just curious, what do you hope queer students and former students or educators hear in this work when it comes out?
That they shouldn't, if we're talking to the educators, oh man, it's such a hard thing where I go back and forth on this, where I think, like, leave that institution. Granted, someone's like very quickly going to replace them and do it very eagerly. So there is the argument for being the change you want to see on the inside. But the other part of me is just like, you're nonetheless, even if you are making some sort of change within that institution, you are, again, nonetheless supporting that institution. You are moving that institution's mission forward in some way, shape, or form, whether it be in a small way or big ways. So I don't really know if I'm saying, like, don't, like, leave, quit, whatever. But I just hope that the students who are there, maybe my message is less for the administrators, because I don't think they're going to listen, and I don't think they want to listen. So I put that aside. What I will say is, for the students who are there, that they're not alone. There are a number of resources out there. I went to Liberty at a time when, YouTube was becoming bigger, Facebook was becoming bigger, but I didn't know how to, or even to search for a lot of the things I could have been searching for at the time. Maybe I could have, like, typed into, YouTube, like, queer Christians or something like that. I just did. And I mean, I always consider myself a late bloomer. I feel like everyone else figured out a lot of things before I did. So when I was that age, I definitely had not figured out a lot of this kind of stuff. So I didn't know that there were supports out there and potential communities out there. Nowadays, I think with, like, again, like Instagram or TikTok, you can find so many voices that can give these folks hope. Communities in some of these spaces on different platforms, and like the evangelical community, I find to be super strong and supportive and wonderful. In the vast majority of cases. So I think that hopefully this book shows folks that they're not alone, and that, again, I don't know how this book's going to find its way into their hands. I hope it does, but if and when it does, I hope that people are able to see themselves in some way, shape, or form, and again, find solace that they're not alone.
Awesome. All right. Well, we're going to completely changed focus. It's been pretty intense of our conversation. So these are my fun part of the conversation that's talking about it's rapid fire questions. These are fun. These are just to have fun, to enjoy, and just come up with whatever comes to your head first.
Okay.
I don't want you to have to. I had someone that I interviewed recently that said, "Oh, but I kind of am long-winded whenever I ask questions. I'm like, answer questions. I'm like, that's not really allowed here. So you better work really fast and not give me a long-winded answer, unless it's warranted. I mean, but I don't think it's going to in this case. But all right, and because I've tried to change this up a little bit with all of my guests this season and last season, because we're technically in season 3 now of my podcast. So I've tried to change them up to that they're more relatable to my guests. So for instance, I know that you grew up like in the Toronto area. And so these are kind of some fun questions that kind of relate to Toronto. So if you have one free afternoon in Toronto, are you going to Kensington Market, the Annex, Queen West, or are you grabbing a coffee and disappearing into a bookstore somewhere?
Can I get with this? Shoot, rapid fire. Kensington Market.
Okay.
I was gonna be like,
All
well, can I
right.
answer it like 2 ways? No, rapid fire.
Okay. And I know pretty much none of these foods. So this is something completely I feel like I need to Google this after we get done. So be honest. What Toronto food are you defending with your whole chest? Pea meal bacon sandwich, Jamaican patties, dim sum, shawarma, or something else?
Jamaican patties. They're so good.
Okay, I'm gonna have to ask you to expand. What are Jamaican patties? Because I have absolutely no idea.
I didn't realize these were. I don't know if they're Toronto specific or Canadian specific. I honestly don't know, and anyone outside of Toronto will have to correct me. But they're these really golden yellow. Uh, what do you call that? Like flaky pastries with stuffed ground beef, but it's like super fine ground beef to the point of like almost like mushy. And it sounds awful, but it's so good. And I always get the spicy ones because those are the best. They're absolutely delicious. I used to get them in the subway in the metro, but that no longer is a thing, I think, for a lot of places. And now, and like also like every like high school cafeteria had them. Places in Kensington Market, that's where I get my Jamaican patties now, are in Kensington Market, to go back to your first question. They're just
Nice.
delicious. They're golden yellow patties, like pastries with like flaky pastry and yeah, ground beef, spicy ground beef.
Okay. Which Toronto weather mood is the most dramatic? Surprise freezing rain, humid summer subway platform, or that one perfect fall day that everyone posts about?
Dramatic. Well, we didn't even get a winter option. I'm going to say the fall. Why not?
Hey, we pretty much had no winter here this year. Yeah, it's unfortunate, but okay. And honestly, I love fall. The colors, it's just so beautiful. Okay. If your life in Toronto had a title like a TIFF indie film, what would it be?
I'm it was considered for a long time, though I don't know if that title still holds, the Mayor of Hanlan's. Hanlan's is a queer clothing optional beach in Toronto, and it's just perfect. It's on the island. So I think that if I were to take any title and to take it very proudly, because that's a title I love because it's my favorite place in North America, if not the world. Hanlan's, the Mayor of Hanlan's.
Nice. Okay, and last, the most Toronto sentence ever. Sorry plus what?
Bud. Or nowadays, I think it's sorry, fam. It's funny. There's a lot of these posts online where they go for like the Toronto accent for that I grew up with to the Toronto accent now. Now it's almost a mix of like patois, like a Jamaican sounding accent. Whereas when I grew up, it
Hmm.
was like sorry, bud. Like you'd always say bud with everything. Now I think the kids are saying fam, but I'm not cool anymore, so I don't really know.
That's okay. All right. Well, Lucas, if someone feels like they're at the very beginning, and this is not a rapid fire question, by the way, if someone listening feels like they're at the very beginning of unlearning fear or shame, What's one small practical step you'd encourage them to take? Something that feels doable and not overwhelming.
I would say that community is super, super, super important, and finding someone who not only is a listening ear, not someone who necessarily wants to hear their own voice, which we all know a lot of those people, unfortunately, but to find someone who has a listening ear, who believes what you have to say. And one of the number one traumatizing or re-traumatizing things that can happen to people who experience things like conversion therapy or high control religion more broadly, is that when people don't believe them, it's a re-traumatizing experience and can actually make things worse. So I'd say definitely community. I would say writing about your experiences is a great way of externalizing those feelings or thoughts and getting that outside of you, right? That typically we hold all of our words and our emotions and our thoughts inside. And so to get that outside and then to share that with people, I think that's also a really healing moment and a beautiful moment. And obviously I'm biased because I am a writer, but I think that it can really be dramatically and profoundly impactful. Therapy is a really great tool. We should all be going to therapy. So I think that's something to take care of our mental health. I'd say those are the three things that come to mind right away. Maybe that's not the novel, but it could lead to a novel, maybe.
No, but they're all good ideas. I like that. And I agree with you on the writing. I think that's really important. I agree actually on all three because community is huge. Writing, you're feeling getting it on paper. I mean, I would do paper. Yes, we're in obviously a technology age where there might be people who want to type on like, their computer or whatever, but still personally, writing to me is the best way to do it. That's just that's just me. That's the Gen Xer in me. I like to be able to write everything down. All right. Well, Luke, thank you so much. Seriously, the care that you have you're bringing into your work, the conversation. This is powerful, and I know it's going to resonate with so many people, especially listeners who are navigating identity, faith, shame, and of course the long road back to themselves. So I thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
And for everyone listening, if this episode connected with you, supported you, or gave you language for something you've been carrying, please share it with someone who may need to hear it as well. You can also follow, rate, and review this podcast, Empowered and Out. It really does help more people find these conversations. And of course, if you are looking for support around confidence, identity, authenticity, or rebuilding after harmful work or life environments, you can book a call with me, and link is in the show notes. Take care of yourselves. Take what you need from this conversation. Be empowered and be out. And I will see you in the next episode.